I'm speaking today with Pete Mauney, brilliant photographer from Tivoli, New York. Pete, thanks for meeting with me here today.
My pleasure.
In your photographs, you've covered skyscapes, firefly escapades, star configurations, and more. But it seems to me that you have a special interest in the activity at the Tivoli waterfront. Can you tell me about what draws you to the Hudson River in Tivoli again and again?
It's interesting. I tend not to think too much about what I'm doing, so it's always interesting for me to try to figure it out when I'm asked, which is fairly infrequently. It's beautiful, of course. That goes without saying. It's just a large body of water. I'm drawn to water. Great views with the mountains across the river. That's all kind of obvious surface stuff. When I first moved to Tivoli, which was about 26 years ago or so, I would go down to the river and photograph frequently. And over a period of time, I kind of stopped, and I kind of stopped photographing in Tivoli altogether for a long time, sort of based on the feeling, I am too familiar with it. I just don't see anything anymore. So I kind of stopped for a long time, but I still kept going to the river. I try, with or without a camera, I try to at least go look at the river, even if it's just for a few seconds. I try to do that every day. I don't always succeed, but I find that it's probably about as effective as antidepressants. And so I think what got me started photographing there again is just because you're familiar with something, I guess, doesn't mean that there isn't something there to see. And the thing that I'm kind of struck by is that while the river, essentially its borders, its shapes, the fact that it's full of water, all of the basics never change, but the appearance changes every day. Sometimes really subtly and minimally, like when the leaves are starting to change. Sometimes pretty drastically. Today is a pretty good example. I went down to photograph a tugboat this morning with my daughter after I picked her up from nursery school. And we got down there and we could hear it. And even though it was just a few hundred feet away, because the shipping channel is right on, it hugs the coast in Tivoli. Even though it was a few hundred feet away, we couldn't see it. There's nothing to see. We could hear it. Once it passed, the wake came and we saw that. And within 1 hour, the fog had completely burned off and it was clear as a bell again. So, that's a pretty drastic shift in about an hour. So I kind of like the idea that even though I'm essentially working on the particular project that I'm working on the river with right now, I like the idea that within the limitations, within the geographic limitations that I'm working, that never really change, the subtle details change a lot. And I like the ideas of, I like trying to work within the limitations and try to find a new way basically to take the same picture over and over again. More recently, that's been my thoughts on shooting on the river.
And I've noticed that you capture a number of barges that go up and down. And how do you get the specific information of the name of the barge, its cargo, its origin and destination?
It's due to the joys of modern technology. People think I'm sort of a geek about this and that I know all this stuff, but I really, really don't, which is kind of why I started photographing them. I've been going down there for years and watching cargo ships go by. I'll backtrack a little bit. One thing is that for the most part, I generally avoid the tugs and barges, actually. And mostly what I'm going down there for are the large international cargo ships. So I like the idea of that sort of international connection between the Hudson Valley and all over the world, whether we're receiving goods such as, a giant bulk carrier came up recently, and of all things, it was bringing a huge load of sand to a cement plant. I mean, who would have thought that, we would need to import sand, but we do. It needs to get from one place to another somehow. General Electric up outside of Albany ships a lot of stuff out, so a lot of stuff goes out that way. A lot of oil from the oil boom that's presently going on in the Dakotas comes by train to Albany, where it's loaded up onto boats and shipped around the Atlantic coast up to New Brunswick, where it gets refined. So I like that sort of connection. I do photograph the tugboats on occasion, but mostly what I'm interested in are the large ships, the international trips. And as far as getting the information on them, there are apps. So I have 3 apps on my phone that track what are called AIS transmissions, which are most commercial vessels are required to have these AIS transponders that allow people to know where they are, basically, whether it be the owners of the ship or the Coast Guard or, geeks like myself running around taking pictures of them. I can use these apps that tell me generally accurately, although quite often inaccurately, what the destination of the ship is, what type of ship it is. As far as the barges, I've just sort of gotten used to them, and I've gotten to know them because they tend to be the same barges and tugs back and forth that operate in the Hudson. I know some of them carry heating oil, some of them carry gasoline, some of them carry rocks, so I've just kind of figured that out over time. And also there's an odd, and I'm sure this is the case in many places, but there's an odd and sort of quirky small community of pretty varied backgrounds, although pretty much only men, who follow these things and have Facebook groups. So right now, there's a man down on the river here in Tivoli who's from Pleasant Valley. Who's a nice guy, propane delivery guy, and on all of his time off, he spends chasing tugboats up and down the Hudson. He's been down on the riverfront in Tivoli since 8 o'clock this morning. And waiting for a bunch to come through because of the fog. They had all stopped in Kingston, so he's been kind of waiting around with nothing to do for most of the day. But, so I get information from them as well. So there are these small sort of communities that keep track of these things that I follow.
Great. The sunsets behind the mountains across the river from Tivoli are so spectacular. What do you look for specifically to capture in a sunset shot that would differentiate it from not so spectacular shots?
That's a tricky question. I'm one of those people who probably spent far too many years in school, and I always loved sunsets when I was growing up. I mean, they're spectacular. I mean, who ultimately doesn't love a sunset? I mean, they're beautiful. But it was not certainly something that I would have ever thought about trying to capture with a camera. It's just something I was just way too snotty, basically, to pursue something as banal as a sunset, and which didn't stop me from enjoying them personally and looking at them, but. It wasn't something that I photographed. And so over time, as I've sort of gotten away from being uptight about things like that, and, different things that have happened in my life and circumstances that have changed, I've kind of come around to just not caring about that kind of stuff anymore. And, if it's beautiful, I'll take a picture of it. And if I don't have a camera, well, it's still pretty darn beautiful, and I'll look at it. Shoot a lot of sunsets that I never do anything with. I post some sunsets that I wonder why I bothered to photograph in the first place. And then others that are just so stunning. And it's certainly not something that you can actually capture with a camera, but it's... Here's an interesting, I'll go on a little tangent. There was recently about 3 weeks ago, there was a particularly stunning sunset. It was one of the top 10 I've seen. And I was at work, ironically, in a dark room where I can't see anything. And I came out and I looked out and I thought, there's going to be an amazing sunset. I just knew it. And I just, it started happening and I ran home. I got my camera, I got my oldest daughter, and we went running down to the river and basically missed it. I saw a lot of it in the car, but it was extraordinary sunset, but it was very quick moving. Missed most of it. It caught a few pictures at the tail end of it. But ultimately missed it. I did not end up posting any on Facebook of that because the pictures that I took I just wasn't that interested in. Although the sunset had just been absolutely spectacular. That night and into the next day, however, just all these people that I'm on Facebook with, all the way down from New York City, all the way north to past Albany, all were posting photographs of the same sunset because there was a particular sort of weather front that was kind of following the river. So the experience of people over about a 200-mile range was pretty similar. And it was just really amazing to just go on there and find 20, 30 different views of the same thing that everybody had experienced in a slightly different way. And so I found that kind of spectacular. As for my criteria of what makes one sunset better than the other, I don't know if I really have any. It's just I either like the pictures I took or I don't. And I either post them or I don't. I don't have a checklist of criteria for what makes a successful sunset. So I don't know if I can really answer that part of the question very well.
Would you share with us perhaps some of your technical preferences? Do you favor aperture priority or shutter priority, or depending on the situation? Or are there any favorite lenses or filters you like to use down by the river?
That's a tricky question. Generally speaking, I try not to talk about technical things, mostly because my what I do for a living tends to be kind of technical, so I try not to spend too much time considering that. I mostly have one lens that, I probably take 90% of my pictures with. I mean, I have a whole stable of lenses at home, but for when I'm shooting on the river, about 90% of them are all with one lens. It's a very, very wide angle zoom lens. I prefer, generally speaking, wide angle. As for the technical settings on the camera, there's no one thing that I prefer over the other, except for depending on what the situation requires. Sometimes it requires manual, sometimes it requires automatic. There's not really a clear way to answer that. So yeah, I don't have a lot to add on that end of it.
Well, the technical aspects of photography aside, can you speak to the, for want of a better word, spiritual aspects the river lends to our community?
Yeah, sure. I mean, personally, I'm not a particularly spiritual person, for better and for worse. It's just the way I am. It's not a choice. But what I would say is that it gives us all in the area, whether we actively seek it out or not, it gives us a sort of common frame of reference in the community. Everybody knows where the river is. Everybody knows what it is, whether it's something as simple as asking for and or giving directions. It's on that side of the river, or it's on this side of the river. You go north along the river, you go south along. So there's something as basic as that, as well as some of the more sort of indescribable things, such as experiencing sunsets or just other levels of beauty. So I'm not. I don't have a lot to say on this, on what I would call the spiritual aspect, mostly because, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess spirituality is a subjective thing. I'm kind of half talking to myself because I haven't really thought about that question too much. But I mean, the joy that you get out of seeing something indescribably beautiful, in so much as that can be a spiritual thing, I guess. I guess that's my spiritual experience of it.
I have to tell you, I had trouble with that word spiritual, and I couldn't find the right word, to capture what I wanted to ask you
Sure,
about that.
and I can see why that would be tricky. Yeah, because that's a loaded word.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And before we end, could you tell us a little about what sparked your interest in photography and who helped you along the way to develop your talent?
That's a good question. I think about that quite often, and I think ultimately it's a range of things. I've always been a bit of a loner most of my life, and I moved around a lot when I was growing up. So I tended to not actually ever be a direct participant in things growing up as a kid, but I was always an observer. I was the guy on the side of the room or in the dark corner watching everything. And so I think that sort of continued along in my life. I've always watched things. I've always observed things. I have some desire to sort of capture and catalog as well, so I think that's part of it. But in terms of specifically about photography, I would have to say the one sort of consistent voice I had on that throughout my life was my grandmother. My grandmother was an avid, albeit painfully humble photographer. She's very, very, very good, extraordinary eye, but completely self-deprecating. She never would have accepted that level of analysis from anybody. She just wasn't interested in hearing that, but it was always an influence for me. I mean, she was a photographer from a kid. Her father was a travel writer, and she would, as a kid, take the photographs that would illustrate his books, and she kept doing it throughout her life, literally until she died in her late 90s. She always had a camera with her. Most of what she took, she threw out. I have a large collection of other people's old photo negatives that were partly inspired. One of several reasons that got me interested in collecting other people's old negatives and digitizing them and putting them on the internet was that my grandmother, who was this fantastic photographer, had thrown out most of her negatives. And that just caused me this sort of immense amount of anguish. So I mean, even that sort of, I guess, hobby, I guess you could call it, was inspired by her. I did manage to find a few of her negatives, one of which is one of my seriously all-time favorite photographs that I look at all the time and is kind of always with me. That's an inspiration for me. She gave me my first camera when I was a kid that I loved using. And, I didn't take a lot of pictures. I just kind of toyed around with it. I didn't take it seriously for a long time. I did a little bit of photography in high school. I would borrow SLRs from the school, from this AV class that I took. But during high school and then college, I drifted into the film world. So I worked in motion film for several years. I originally went to college for that at NYU and dropped out of NYU after a while and then worked in the film business and found myself unemployed after a certain point of time and living in the Hudson Valley and figured, I'll just, I'll go back to school thing. I mean, it's still about capturing visual information. And so I kind of ditched film and started doing that. And that was about, about 25 years ago or so. So I've been doing that ever since. And all throughout that, I had my grandmother, who was sort of an inspiration as well as, somebody who would sort of prod me along and always took an interest in it. And so I guess that's about as good an answer as I can come up with for that.
Well, thank you, Pete. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. If any of our listeners wish to take a peek at Pete's photos, you can find him on Instagram, Pete_Mauney. That's Mauney. This is Kathy O'Connor for WGXC.